Men's gender-exclusive spaces, such as fraternal organizations, mutual support organizations, sports clubs, camps, and schools, have experienced a gradual decline or complete dissolution since the 1940s. The multifaceted question of who or what was responsible for this demise points largely to feminist activism, reactionism from religious fundamentalism, and other social forces as contributors to their demise. So what exactly happened? Mid-20th century feminist activism was a significant driver of social change. As women insisted on their presence in spaces designed and structured for men and their specific needs, their overarching aim was the dismantling of patriarchal structures that they believed were made possible by male-exclusive spaces. Their arguments, activism, and legal actions advocated the idea that gender differences were purely anatomical, with no substantial psychological variations, and that any recognition of gender differentiation was seen as a barrier to opportunity. Simultaneously, as the feminist movement was challenging societal norms in the 1950s and 1960s, religious fundamentalism gained momentum. The post-World War II era saw a considerable shift towards social liberalism. Many factors propelled this change, including the culture of war itself, which had represented a reprieve from societal norms. Liberated from the confines and social rules of everyday society, American men during the war had explored new freedoms and avenues of self-expression. This shift found reflection in the popular culture of the post-war years, in provocative forms such as rock and roll music and films that challenged traditional social values. The Beat Generation, noted for exploring taboo subjects like drug use, sexuality, and nonconformity, wielded significant influence as well. Religious fundamentalism, recoiling from these dramatic societal changes, sought to restore what they perceived as moral order. This resistance took several forms. Some fundamentalist groups reinforced traditional religious teachings, emphasizing strict adherence to scripture and doctrines endorsing conventional gender roles and conservative lifestyles. This could be seen in many fundamentalist Christian groups' efforts to enforce the concept of the male breadwinner, maintain the sanctity of marriage, and brand sexual promiscuity or sex between men as sinful. They also partook in political lobbying and campaigns against the decriminalization of certain drugs and the liberalization of divorce laws, thus mirroring their conservative values. These actions reflected their intent to counteract what they viewed as society's moral decay. Concurrently, there was an increasing focus on sexual behavior as a driver of societal change. The 1948 Kinsey Report, a groundbreaking study on men's sexuality, upended long-standing assumptions and sparked broader public discourse on sexuality. The open conversation on previously taboo subjects proved threatening to certain societal groups. This brings us to a third contributing factor, the emergence of sexual identity politics. The post-war years marked a significant departure from the conservative sexual mores of the 1940s, as men began to be more open about their sexual lives. This shift extended beyond sexual activity and introduced a new concept, sexual identities. Certain groups of men started to define themselves and their peers through the lens of sexual preference alone. The embrace of identities based on sexual preference indicated a fundamental shift, suggesting that a man's preferred sexual activities fully informed both his sensibilities and his worldview. For embracers of sexual identities, gender ceased to be their primary identifier. However, by identifying primarily with their sexual preferences rather than their gender, men arguably contributed to the fragmentation of male-exclusive spaces. In a world of fragmented masculinity without a unifying force, men's spaces and their capacity to provide mutual support and networking opportunities based on gender were undermined. The rationale behind these spaces was the unity of men and a shared gender experience. This shift played an unintended yet significant role in dismantling male-exclusive spaces. As some groups of men started downplaying gender as their primary identification, religious fundamentalist groups, already poised to reinforce conservative values in a rapidly changing society, intensified their enforcement of strict, traditional gender roles. This change in societal dynamics served to alienate many men, especially those growing more public and assertive about their new sexual identities. The conservative values these fundamentalist groups espoused emphasized men's roles as traditional heads of the household, focusing on their duties as providers and protectors. Fundamentalist groups began to frame non-traditional sexual identities as a threat to societal order. Men who primarily identified in terms of sexual preference found themselves ostracized and denounced as violating the natural order and divine law. Fundamentalism and religion were not the only forces reacting to this shift. Women also further capitalized on the newly fractured nature of men's social realities during this period, leveraging shaming as a tool to manipulate men's behaviors. By exploiting societal biases against men who no longer viewed gender as their primary identification, women used a constant threat of ostracization to manipulate men's behaviors and to prevent them from participating in male-exclusive spaces. This looming threat caused men to internalize such fears, turning men into unwilling participants in social engineering efforts aimed at restricting men's attention and gaze to female partners, thereby further eroding the viability of men's spaces. The dissolution of men's gender-exclusive spaces in the 1950s and 1960s resulted from a confluence of societal changes rather than a single catalyst. Feminist activism, surfacing in the aftermath of World War II, questioned gender-exclusive spaces and rallied against them as perpetuators of the status quo. The rise of sexual identity politics further fragmented these spaces, as some men began to align themselves primarily with sex-specific identities rather than with their gender. In the end, both religious fundamentalism and women served as reactionary forces, either reinforcing conservative values or exploiting existing social prejudices to prevent men from associating in gender-exclusive spaces. The dismantling of men's spaces was a multifaceted process, set in motion by women's push for inclusion in men's spaces, and fueled by some men's rejection of gender as their primary identifier, leading to the splintering and demise of cohesive support systems for men.
Checking on all you do from A to Z. So, darling, just be wise. Keep your eyes on me.
Much obliged you hopped on board for this snazzy trip through American life in the 1940s and 1950s, all captured through nifty vintage photographs. If this flick's got your motor running, don't be a square. Click on that jolly bucket of bolts to subscribe to the channel for more top drawer content just like this. Thank you.